Hello and good evening, everyone. This conversation feels like it has been a long time coming. Thank you so much for tuning in today. My name is Spencer Ruckty. I'm the author events manager at Third Place Books, which is up here in Seattle, Washington. I'm very pleased to welcome Edgar Garbelotto, Andrea Lawlor, Mattilda Bernstein Sycamore for this panel on the Brazilian writer João Gilberto Noll and his new book, Hugs and Cuddles, which is out now from Two Lines Press. First of all, I want to invite you all to use the chat window at the bottom of your screen and say hello and let us know where you're calling in from. And I want to start by sincerely thanking Community Bookstore, their events manager, Noah Mintz. They are partners with this event, and Noah and I have shared so many texts and thoughts about Hugs and Cuddles since March or February of last year. And of course, I want to thank Two Lines Press and Chad, Leslie Ann, and Karen for putting in all of the legwork for bringing this incredible group of authors together, and of course, for bringing this book to life. There are so few publishers not only publishing literature and translation exclusively, but have the rare ability to make it exciting and colorful and meaningful and accessible to new audiences. So thank you to Two Lines Press. I also want to plug a few events that Community Bookstore and Third Place Books are working on together over the next few months. If your interest is literature and translation, we have some wonderful offerings for you. On November 15th, we have a virtual event with classicist Stephanie McCarter for her new translation of Ovid's Metamorphosis. McCarter is the first female translator of the epic into English in over 60 years. And in this new edition, she addresses accuracy in translation and its representation of women, gender dynamics of power and sexual violence within Ovid's classic. And then on December 7th, we're teaming up with Community Bookstore and the Transnational Literature Series at Brookline Booksmith to bring you a virtual conversation with French translators Emma Ramadan and Olivia Bays. They are discussing new works by Margaret Duras and her friend and protege, Barbara Molinard, who has never been published in English until now. Her collection, Panics, has been basically waiting around since 1969, and I tell you, it is incredible. As mentioned, that chat window is open at the bottom of your screen. Please keep saying hello, give us commentary during the course of the event. During the last 15 minutes or so, we will have time for your questions. So if you have questions for our authors this evening, you can submit those in the Q&A window at the bottom of your screen. We also offer closed captions for anyone who is interested. Just click that live transcript button at the bottom of your window to turn this feature on or off. A reminder that this event will be recorded, so if you miss anything or have to duck out, we'll be emailing a recording to everyone who registered. And of course, you can order Hugs and Cuddles from your neighborhood bookstore. If you're in Seattle, stop by any of our 3 locations in Lake Forest Park, Ravenna, or Seward Park. And if you're in New York, you should make a beeline for Community Bookstore out in Brooklyn. Each purchase you make supports the future of our author series and lets us keep putting on virtual programming, so thank you. And now, without further ado, I am very pleased to introduce tonight's speakers. With us, we have translator Edgar Garbelotto. He is the translator of João Gilberto Noll's Lord in 2019 and Harmada in 2020, both published by Two Lines Press. He holds an MFA in creative writing from the University of Illinois, and Terra Incognita, written in both Portuguese and English, is his debut novel. Then calling in next door in Seattle is Mattilda Bernstein Sycamore, the author of The Freezer Door, which is a wonderful book published by Semiotext and was one of Oprah Magazine's best LGBTQ books of 2020 and a finalist for the Penn Jean Stein Book Award. Her latest anthology, Between Certain Death and a Possible Future, Queer Writing on Growing Up with the AIDS Crisis, was named one of the 100 most influential queer books of all time by Book Riot. And her next book, Touching the Art, will be published by Soxgold Press in November 2023. And of course, we have Andrea Lawlor, whose book, Paul Takes the Form of a Mortal Girl, has been a cult favorite amongst booksellers since its publication. And for as long as I can remember, Andrea is the recipient of the Whiting Award for Fiction and has been awarded fellowships by Lambda Literary and Radar Labs. We are here, of course, to discuss the work of the Brazilian author João Gilberto Noll. In his lifetime, Noll appeared in Brazil's leading periodicals. He was a guest of the Rockefeller Foundation, King's College London, as well as a Guggenheim Fellow. Now, Hugs and Cuddles is a very difficult sell, as we call it in the book selling industry. But there are plenty who have articulated this wonderful, the wonderful and grotesque aspects of this novel, probably much better than myself. I read this book in this form, in a bright orange manuscript form, back in February when it looked a little bit like this. Some of you might have seen this on Twitter around that time, but I just want to document for posterity that this manuscript came for booksellers with stickers that said, I am no longer part of the cosmic plan designed by a despot, and keep honking, I'm reading João Gilberto Noll's queer epic, Hugs and Cuddles. And those stickers, one of them is on my car right now, so it lives in immortality. Lily Meyer for NPR wrote a fine piece about the novel, calling it completely consuming and gleefully dirty, wrenchingly serious, and probably one of my favorite deep dive pieces that have come out so far. Jenny Wu for Astra Magazine writes that Noll's novel proposes a new model of sociality, one in which sexual reciprocity is the basis of social exchange. Here, erotic encounters become testing grounds for new political systems and kinship figure configurations. Noll really does reach for the divine here with his queer imagination. It breaks boundaries and shakes you alive. Please join me in welcoming Edgar, Mattilda, and Andrea to your screen to discuss this amazing book.
Hello.
Hello, everybody.
We're so excited to be here. And Edgar, we're hoping you will read to us a little bit.
Okay, I can read a little bit. Walking down the street, I saw a rent boy hanging around Redemption Park. I approached him and asked him how much it was. He gave me his price, which I thought was reasonable. I invited him to go to a bar first, right there on João Pessoa Street. I said I'd pay him later. The boy said that was how things worked anyway. We had many beers. Sometimes he'd go behind the counter, showing some familiarity with the bar owner. And then he'd come back with things in his hands, things he'd pour into my glass. He'd say it was just to add some flavor. But I knew that was not it, that it was a sedative or something. I had read articles about these rent boys who dropped mysterious pills into their clients' drinks so they could more easily steal their wallets when they passed out. I saw all that coming, but I had no strength to avoid such a disaster. Let the boy exercise his own nighttime rights. Let him steal whatever he wanted from me. I was offering everything, letting myself become enraptured by what was unfolding. It came to me that before I lost control of the situation, I should reach out to the boy's body and excite him. Before he could steal everything from me, I needed to approach that body now stretched in bed. It might have been a bed in a cheap hotel, typical of those type of encounters. I don't know. I don't remember where I was, but I approached him and I started undressing him slowly, trailing my tongue across him, from head to toe and back. When his arousal came, obeying his age's dynamo, I deal with my own body. What I know is that the boy stood up and I fell from the bed, grabbing his legs. What did the begging position mean? Maybe a biblical scene. Wrapped in a sheet, I looked like a leper begging for a miracle, or an individual already paralyzed, spending his time crawling at the feet of luminous young men. I was in no condition to distinguish a set choreography from a living picture like this, but I was thinking about that. Out of nowhere came a kick in my stomach and I shut up. Now I was a slave. I had no chance or voice. I was sure the boy would end me right there. He kicked me in the chest. From what I could see, a splash of blood gushed out of my arm and hit me right in the eye. If I were a movie, blood would spray on the camera. There, lying on the ground, without feeling any pain, lying there, hazy, I touched my groin. I was about to reach orgasm. the thing was going to explode, yes. But in that moment, I received another kick, this time in my groin. Again, I didn't really feel any pain. What I know is that upon being kicked, I finally came so intensely, it seemed an act of dying. Then I passed out. I think I'm going to stop here.
That was amazing to hear you read this.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's great to stop when we all passed out. That seems like the perfect transition. And I think one thing this book does so well is show this kind of relentless, kind of sex-saturated fantasia, right? Where desire and reality are kind of and fantasy are all intertwined. And I think it was really interesting that you chose that moment, which is really a transition moment in the book. And I won't give that away exactly, but I wondered maybe if you wanted to talk a little bit about, because the prose of the book is so fluid. And, you know, I've read it only in this English translation. And sometimes when I read translated text, I can really see the gaps, sometimes unintentional gaps, or the kind of, I guess, where it becomes more formal, where it shouldn't be. And here, I really felt that fluidity throughout. And I think the book itself depends so much on that fluidity. And I wonder if you wanted to talk a little bit, Edgar, about how you maintain that in the translation.
Yeah, that's a good question. I came across this text when it came out in Brazil in 2008. And then two things attracted me this text: the language itself, which was very unusual even for Brazilian standards. It was a very unique syntax, a very unique flux. It's a whole paragraph, and the plot, if you want to call, develops through a continuous stream of consciousness. Let's put it that way. Yeah, I was very attracted by that text. And of course, I was very attracted by the thematics. And at that point, it came in a very important point of my life when I was adopting English as my writing language. It was a process that I was going through. And for me to be reading that text so unusual in Portuguese and having the desire to translate that into English, which was my adopted language, it was a very interesting process. I was only able to translate this text in the past, I started in 2020, and that was a whole different experience as well in terms of being during the pandemic, where the body was it seemed to be under attack, let's say. And here was a novel that was written with the body in a different dimension, of course, the sexual body or the loving body. Yeah, am I answering your question?
Yeah, I think that's great. And I love that intertwining between your writing process and the translation process. I think that's something that people don't talk about so much, right? Because I feel like there's often this idea that translators are separate from writers, when of course all translators are also writers. And I love that intermingling of the two, and also that question of the pandemic. Yeah, how do you feel like that impacted? I mean, you said about this sort of when the body was under attack, and in the book, I think the body is also under attack, right? Mm-hmm. You know, under attack from this sort of abstract, in some ways, abstract question of this kind of like fascistic, you know, world around. And then there's also the attacks in the interpersonal, the realm of, you know, where sex is all kept in private, and where the fantasy is the only way to escape. So I wonder, would you be interested in talking about that question of the body being under attack in the book as well?
Yeah, definitely. As I said, it was during the pandemic. It was my work took about a year, It was a year of a completely immersion in the text. And that's one of the selfish reasons why a translator decides to go on this crazy adventure, is just to spend time with the text. And of course, with everything that was going on in the world, I had that time. I was allowed to do that. And I was really immersed in the body experience. So going now to your question, yeah, this is a body that defies gender and sexuality. It's a body that is, I feel like, is in the service of love. At the end of the day, is a love story. That's how I felt. A love story that was impossible to realize in the, let's say, in the eyes of society. And that's why at some point they had to retire themselves to a forest. It was a prohibited love. It was an impossible love. And a utopian felt through the body to the point where the body starts to transform itself in order to realize that love. I'm very curious to hear about your opinion, and Andreas, about this point, because for me, really, the body is at the center stage in this novel. And yeah, sex, lots of sex.
Well, I mean, I was really immediately taken before the event started. We were talking a little bit about what you might read, and I was a little bit gunning for the first few pages, really, which is what had originally just being introduced to the first few pages of the book. I was just grabbed by the propulsive sort of forward movement, constant, what did Mattilda say in the chat? Relentless sexual fantasia. But the propulsion and the forward movement and that sort of like breathlessness was really interesting to me in a book that is so concerned with the granularity of the body, with smells, with tastes, with the way it's sort of like mechanics of sex. And it was really I was sort of stunned by that pacing. And I want to hear what Mattilda has to say. So maybe I have a question related to this in translation, but I'm really curious, Mattilda, how you encountered it and what sort of stood out for you. I'm also trying to give things away.
Totally. Well, there's so much. I don't think we can really give it away because there's so many changes throughout the book. But I think one thing that there was a moment for me, and it was about 18 pages into the book. And because when I first start reading, I'm reading a flow, but I don't necessarily, it's not felt exactly, right? It's more, I think, intellectualized in a certain way, or more in the head. And then there's this place, I was about 18 pages in, when it moves into this dream of desire, and which is also this desire for the dream. And then at the same time, because dreams are not just positive, right? So there's also this waking nightmare that's also in between the dream and the beyond, if that makes sense. And the experience for me was that I had this, really like a chill going through my body. And that chill was this like opening into the desire, which is the text, of course. And it's this shift in awareness and this like connection between inside and outside, because I feel like those boundaries in the book are not stable. And so when everything is together, I feel like there's this fantasy that's kind of inside the experience of memory, and it's also inside breath, and they kind of lead back and forth, one to the other, until there really isn't any between. And so that's the kind of space that I feel like the text really conjures. There's it's like both between and beyond, and it goes back and forth, right? And And then it goes to like way beyond, you know, to like absolute extremes. But I feel like in a way, there's this quiet place, which is that place where they're all at once, like the between, the beyond, the what's happening in the actual world and what's happening in the desired world. And that felt like a kind of, I think that's the magic in a way, right? That's this world that kind of opens up. Yeah, I wonder what do you two think about that experience?
Well, I love that you said that that's the magic. For me, that totally, it's true that fluidity is sort of like the fluidity between the hypothetical and the sort of the future possibility and the dream and the transformation, and the past and the memory. I think that was the sort of like the motion, the narrator sort of motioned through this epic sex journey and body journey. It feels inevitable, and I think there's something happening. Yeah, there's something happening with that sort of like very fluid syntax. And I guess the thing, yeah, I mean, Edgar, what is your response to that? What Mattilda was saying?
Yeah, both of you mentioned the word memory, and it's interesting that in that sense, the novel is very traditional because it starts with, let's say, childhood and how that memory carries in the body throughout life, right? So it's that initial experience, that initial arousal, that initial love affair that is felt in the body, even though the kids don't know what's going on, or they kind of know, but it's, of course, this is narrator thinking later in life. So that's why it has the memory aspect of it. So the narrator now looks back and understands that was the initial prompt, the initial movement that set up his enterprise in this journey of going through body changes and desire changes. Yeah, so the memory aspect is there, and then it's imprinted in the body in a way that determines the rest of the life of this man. So even though he tries to have a normal life, getting married, having a son, the overpowering heritage of those memories enable him to have a regular life, or what is considered a heteronormative life. And his desires are so prohibited and so unspeakable that it's interesting that Noll decided to adopt such pornographic, vulgar language. I feel that Noll himself was trying to find a way of telling this story that was so sexual to begin with, that tell the story of this desire that was so unspeakable to begin with.
You know, it's interesting to me that to think, because there's so much public sex in the book, and there's so much sort of it has this quality of what you're talking about, this sort of sense of like really graphic sex. And is it pornography? Is it erotica? I'm not going to weigh in on those terms, but there's sex is so much the focus of the book, and bodies, that I guess it's sort of surprising to hear you say that. And then it brings me to something the translator Bruna Dantas Labata said in a talk I heard, where she was talking about queerness is something that's like not easily translated, and maybe that's okay. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about Noll's relationship to, because this doesn't feel like a identitarian sort of like a narrative of transition, or like an anthemic narrative of queer liberation. It's very complex, and reminds me of texts that are definitely not that sort of.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
I'm with you because if you think about it, in any moment, the word gay or queer or those words are used. So in that sense, it goes, I would say, post-identity even. The novel tries to reach this place where it's post-identity in a sense that some nomenclature is not even possible. So that's why I mentioned that I feel like Noll himself was trying to find a way of telling this story. And he was also having fun with the language. I feel that for me, there were moments that are purely funny, that are fun to read. So I like to think of I like the idea of that he was having fun through it.
Yeah, I feel like he's constantly playing with the reader. Like, I feel like, I think it's only like 43 pages in when we find out there's suddenly a wife. And you're like, wait, a wife?
Yeah.
Where'd that come from? How did that happen? And so I feel like every time, it comes to a place where we're expecting a particular narrative arc, it kind of like, like this whole notion, like in traditional or like, sort of corporate, publishing, right? That we start, this place, you describe the characters, then they have problems, they solve the problems, and then there's some like redemptive arc in the end, right? And so he's constantly sort of playing with that, where it's like every time you think there's some kind of clarity, then the clarity is contested, right? Or you think like, oh, what is that really weird thing that just happened? Well, it can't get weirder than that. He's like, well, let me show you, and he's like, oh, you want redemption? I'm going to give you resurrection, and it's like, and this boundary even between living and dying, right? And is not, there's that boundary is not respected, and and the way that desire plays into that. There was this one quote, let me just find it. It's, he says, I was constantly reborn with every outburst of libido. As much as I'd get disappointed by one partner or another, and as much as I needed to escape from someone's presence after I came, I knew how to touch another body. It was as if I touched a live wire and died, then was born again from the same electric shock. So like in a sense, the book is that electric shock, right? It's that like, and it's constant, right? There's a death, there's rebirth. And so I think it's that sense of like everything at once, that, I mean, there is a narrative and but at the same time, within that, there's the everything at once.
Yeah. That also sort of like, there's a feeling for me of time isn't linear, and our choices aren't linear, and that sort of layered or kind of pentimento effect of this sort of all of a sudden there's a wife, all of a sudden there's this massive transformation of embodiment, but then all of a sudden we realize that the transformation is happening slowly. There's some really interesting moves in this book that I think are so far from anything else I've read that is looking at bodies in transformation in this particular way that feels both not literal and not allegorical. And I'm not really sure, I'm still sort of wrapping my head around what the book is doing. And maybe Edgar, having spent so much more time with it, you've got thoughts about that, but there's something about the way it works, which is magical, you said before, Mattilda, and I feel like that's part of it. That's right. That's part of it. But there's something that is happening in the flatness of some of the affect or the movement and the sort of like the relentlessness, the repetition of the sex, like the choreography of the different kinds of sex, feels to me like it's kind of casting a spell in some way.
It's interesting that the passage that Mattilda was reading, very existential too, as sex is a way to renew life, or it's a way of being reborn until he dies, metaphorically, and also it seems for real. At some point, he does die. Oh, I hope I'm not giving away, but I guess it's fine. So, so you can see that actual death as metaphorical or actual, but the reality is that Noll is definitely playing with the fact that that body or that identity has been died and has died, and what is coming out of it is a new person. We cannot even say a new man or a new woman or it's a new person. And this transformation, as you said, Andrea, it's slow. It goes through, I think on the second half of the book, the transformation lasts for many, many pages. It's a way that the narrator is trying to understand what is happening, but also feel like the narrator and the writer are trying to find his way as well. One thing that always strikes me about Noll is the way he uses language to search for something throughout his novels. And he's not really shy in sharing that process with us. He's not giving us a finished product. Honestly, this novel is not perfect. It has, for me, it's a work in progress, like the narrator's in the character's body was a work in progress. It's a way of searching for something. You can call it searching for the ideal love, searching for the ideal partnership, searching for the ideal way of telling this story. So for me, there is a clear match between the form and the content here.
Yeah, and I think what you said earlier about humor, I think is really key here, because I feel like there's this constant sense that he's really playing with us. You know, like almost at the very end of the book, he has this line where he says, "I lived on subtleties." And there's not subtle, there's no subtleties. Like it's like he has those lines where he'll just kind of pull back for a second, you know, and that's like 10 pages from the end of the book, like where it's the opposite of subtle, you know. And the same thing with setting, where one moment, you know, it's like I said, you know, the beginning is all this, you know, it's like a very gay, erotic world. And then suddenly there's this straight marriage, you know, and then suddenly they're on a submarine. And where's the submarine going? And then there's this like kind of this narrative about, you know, Nazis. And then that sort of connects with this kind of potential like dystopian fascist reality that's happening in, you know, in the world right there in Brazil. And so I think, but I feel like there's some of these lines where, because there's the really over the top lines, which are very obvious, but then there are the lines that are kind of subtle, but they're like the opposite of subtle in their impact, right? So like, I was just thinking, oh, right, the other thing, like at the very end of the book, he says, could I still cultivate something resembling hope? Which is like, you know, that's like to me, that's like a commentary on the whole thing where the novel is supposed to have that moment, right? So he's like, oh, I'm just going to put that in there, you know? So I just really always appreciated those kinds of games that are being played with narrative and with context and with setting and with place and with the reader. The reader is involved, I think, in those.
And how do you feel about the one paragraph? Do you think, what role do you think it plays into all this that you're talking about?
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I feel like definitely, like for anyone who doesn't know, the book is all one paragraph. There are no breaks. So that relentlessness, it definitely, it's interesting because there are times when it becomes tiring. You're like, whoa, is this gonna, whoa. But I feel like there is this really fascinating arc. It's hard to imagine it because having read it as all one paragraph, it's hard to imagine it otherwise now. So I feel like it does allow for all of those kinds of transitions to kind of have it's like this, right? It's like a snaking kind of structure. And with a break, there might be more impact in certain places, but it wouldn't have maybe that same relentlessness, I guess. Yeah, what do you think about that, Andrea?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's sort of like, I just found myself, it was like buckled in and on a ride. And I would sometimes feel like, oh my God, there have been so many changes on this page, that changes of state, whether it's, from hard to soft, or, like changes of body, changes of scene, and kind of blending into each other, that I'd follow and I'd follow and I'd follow, and I feel my attention get sort of like, oh, I need to, and I would have to like pull myself out because I wanted to stay in, and I wanted to stay on the ride so badly. I think every sentence led to the next sentence in this way that I don't experience so much prose doing. Like, I think there was a feeling of, well, I can't stop now, but eventually sometimes you do like have to go to bed or whatever. And so I think there is a way in which like the book will wreck your sleep for sure. But that, I think the form is absolutely related to that propulsion.
As a reader, you have to develop your own system to read this novel, and you need to know when to put the brakes.
Yeah.
Of course, as a translator, I was a different kind of reader because I spent a year with it, and I knew where to put the brakes to analyze the text itself. But so Noll is deceased, so he's not here for us to ask. But you wonder if at some point when he was putting the novel together, if he had breaks, and then he decided, no, as Mattilda said, this is a world so meshed in reality fantasy, there are no boundaries between anything actually, that I'm going to make the text represent this world I'm trying to I'm depicting. Yes.
Yeah, and I think it also allows him to kind of come back to things in this really like another one of my favorite lines is when he says, "The only time I really relaxed was when I was dead." And so, of course, we don't generally think of death as being, a relaxing place, especially if there's like 200 more pages of the book afterwards, right? And so, and then like 50 pages later, he says, and this is really where the humor comes in. Well, that's humor too, but then he brings the humor to like another level when he says, "The status of formerly dead doesn't convey any wisdom, much less prestige," right? So I feel like part of that arc, right, where it's always like, okay, I don't know what's going to happen next, but it's in conversation with itself at the same time, I think.
Yeah. It's death is definitely there throughout the novel, and how it's treated, it's in a very unusual way. And of course, I don't want to get into the corner of thinking about life after death, because that's not the proposal of this book. But as I said before, death is symbolic, and death as death of identity as well for this character, for this narrator.
Absolutely. I wonder if I know we're going to have time for questions from the audience in a little bit, but I wonder if you would tell us a little bit about, like, if there's a story you have about choices you had to make in translating this text, or if there was anything. I was particularly curious about how any choices you had to make around gender in terms of translating the text?
In terms of gender, what is specifically?
I was just curious about if there was anything that that was challenging to translate. Not, as somebody who reads Portuguese extremely poorly, I haven't read the original, and so I don't have a sense at all about the choices you made, or really like your goals in this translation.
Yeah, I mean, Noll is from southern part of Brazil, which uses a very unique, let's say, Portuguese, Brazilian Portuguese that is unique. His choices of words and syntax are very unusual as well. And so as a translator, you're always trying to find the best choices, of course. But here, my approach to it as being Brazilian and being Portuguese being my native language is to really, I tend to be really close to the original text. And then in the transposition to English, it goes through several layers of revisions with native English speakers. So that's where the collaborative nature of translation comes in. So you start dialoguing with other translators and other writers and friends. And I have the luck to have the editor of Two Lines Press, CJ Evans, being a great editor. So the conversation with him and trying to really find the sweet spot of that word, that sentence. Well, in this case, not that paragraph, but the sweet spot, breaking down the elements and then putting them all together. So the challenges of translating this book is the challenge that every translator goes through. It's that internal battle, the decisions that you have to make in every corner, every comma, every period. And again, I'd like to point out the collaborative aspect of it, which is very important. I'm not working in isolation, so there's a village behind it. Yeah.
Hey, I am back. Thank you so much for this wonderful conversation so far. We are now at the audience Q&A portion of our evening. We have a few questions in the queue, but please do, if you have questions for any of our authors this evening, feel free to throw those in the Q&A window or the chat in the screen or at the bottom of your screen, and we will get started. So our first question comes from an anonymous attendee who says, Edgar, can you elucidate Gilberto Noll's place within Brazilian literary circles? How was he accepted during his life and in relation to his queerness?
Yeah, so he was from another generation, right? So let's say he was not openly queer or gay or anything like that. But it's interesting that the older he got, he addressed more and more queerness and gayness in his books. Of course, nothing compares to this one. This is the most explicitly queer and gay. It's interesting that in Brazil, the conversation about this author being gay or not is non-existent. He was critically acclaimed and in the conversation, and not commercially successful, but critically acclaimed. And that always seems to be the focus in Brazil, at least. His queerness was not even, the author's queerness was not even, I guess, brought up to discussion. The previous novel that I translated, Lord, the queer aspect was there, of course, and again, not in a way that it is here in Hugs and Cuddles. But I think if you ask him, he would not be shying away from answering about his queerness.
And then I was also wondering if you might be able to talk about this book in the context of Lord and Harmada as well, which are, Noll's two other novels that you have also translated for Two Lines Press. Where do you think this book lies in the larger context of his work?
Well, first of all, I think it fits within his body of work in the sense of you always have a first person narrator, and you always have a character that is searching for something, a character that has left his previous life behind and is in search for a new life. Be it this character an actor like in Armada, or be a professor like in Lord. Here, I think our character he owns a little farm, but that's not really even relevant. What is relevant is that he's in search. He's in search as the author is in search. I think that I think what is makes all the novels common. What I think is different here is that at this point in his career, he was really, and he didn't really give a damn, I think, anymore about what people thought, and he was really free. As I said before, he was not commercially successful, and so he had no commercial compromise. He really was completely free in this novel, from what I understand.
We have a great question from Mia Spangenberg here, who asks, how did it feel to translate the work of an author who has passed away? And did you ever get to meet Noll and talk to him about this novel or his work in general?
No, unfortunately not. I never met him. I think it's freeing somehow. Yeah, I think if he was alive, I would be more intimidated and more frightened to make decisions. I'm sure he was a very opinionated person, So it's free on that regard, but sometimes, yes, I wish I could make a call. That never happened.
Yeah. I am, without the author on hand to consult, for parts of this translation, I am really curious as well. What were some of what was the most difficult part of rendering this into English? And also for Andrea and Mattilda, I would also ask, what was the most difficult part of the reading experience of this novel? Like, what were there hiccups? Were there parts where your brain kind of phased in and out? Because I know it's not an easy book to read necessarily. It's a very difficult book.
For me, even though I like to think of myself as a very open person sexually, let's say, even some parts made me blush, and I had to catch my breath and look at it objectively as a translator. So my arsenal of dirty words also were not as rich as it is now. So that
was my next question. Yeah.
I have so many synonyms for cock now that I never thought I even had before.
I think for me as a reader, probably the most difficult thing, I think, is also the thing that's one of the strengths of the book, but I think is the relentlessness of it. Because it's, I'm every time you're kind of like that moment I described at the very beginning, the moment when you suddenly feel the desire, or where I did, where I felt that desire and that pulsing inside. And in some ways I wanted to stay there, because I was like, whoa, because that was a moment of kind of like an awakening, right? Because when the text physically moves you in that way, I kind of wanted to be there, but it doesn't stay there. It goes, everywhere. So I think, that in a sense, yeah, I feel like that for me is the most challenging, because I'm like, oh, well, where do I, because it's like, there's not a place, it's always morphing, right? It's always like shifting. And it also, his, in a sense, there's kind of this bravado about it, right? And that part, I don't know. I mean, I don't necessarily relate to, I don't need to relate to a book to like the book though, of course, you know, that's like a mythology that the publishing industry wants us to believe, right? But I feel like that bravado, it's like, look what I can do. There's a lot of that, like as I feel like the writer is speaking through the character, like, watch out, I'm going to do this now, you know? And so, but I also think that is the strength of the book, right? Because you're always, you're just going along, right? You have to, like, that's the only way to read the book.
It's so interesting. Yeah. I mean, I think that was, for me, I was talking earlier about that sort of pull to like keep going, or actually like go to sleep or whatever I had to do. Like how do you get out of the book sometimes? But sometimes when I read books that I have trouble sort of like putting down or getting out of, they're putting me in a more meditative space. And I was interested in thinking about the ways in which this book, it was sort of like being in the movie The Fugitive or something. You're just going. And that was, but like sex fugitive, you know, and so that was really interesting. Or like Sex Pac-Man or something. There's something, Sex Ms. There was something very relentless about that going that wasn't hard for me. But what was hard for me was the tension between wanting to slow down and contemplate some of the things I think I'm being asked to contemplate, like what happens when domesticity it becomes the dirtiest fetish. What happens, like what actually is a cuddle, you know? And I would have to like put the book down and go like take a walk and be like, what's a cuddle? You know? And so that to me was like the tension I was feeling between my desires to go slow and go fast. That was the hardest part of the book for me. But that's not a bad problem to have.
Yeah, no, not necessarily. Yeah, that's it. And I think talking more openly about, like, right, when I say difficulty, I don't necessarily mean it's like oh, well, that makes it, you know, a bad reading experience or bad book to read. But certainly I think reading experiences should be complicated. Otherwise, we're just watching Netflix. There are some good things on Netflix, not like dissing streaming, but well, great. Let's see. We have another question from another anonymous attendee who says, it might be too early to tell, but I'm curious about the differences and or similarities between the reception of the book in Brazil in 2008 and then in the US in 2022. Are the contexts different enough to impact the reading of the book, do you think?
Very much so. A very, very interesting question, because in 2008, the moment was different, of course, the debate was different. And I think Noll was being very ahead of his time, having a book like this in 2008. And as I said before, he was never commercially successful, and this one was no exception to that. But it was critically acclaimed. But the conversations about gender identity was not in the place that we are today. So I was very careful, yes, in especially when choosing some terms and some adapting the language to English to make sure that it was updated. But it was not a struggle. It was more a concern, more a preoccupation. It was not. I still think that even though it's from 2008, it's as relevant as never before. This novel, very exigent, very now, and very future too. So I think I mentioned a couple of times, it's post-identity, even post a world that is post love, in the sense that not the romantic ideal, not the romantic idea of what love is in society today, but a new way of living love.
Yeah. Thank you. And we actually have time, I think, for one more question. We have a great question from Natalia. This could be either a quick one or a little bit loaded, but that question is, how is the process of translating the title, Hugs and Cuddles?
That was one of the most difficult parts, to be honest, because in Portuguese, the novel is called, well, the word acenos and so the novel is called Acenos e Afagos. So first of all, there is a rhythm here playing with as, with sounds, and also acenos. An aceno is like a wave or a nod or saying hi, something like that. That it doesn't really have an equivalent in English, The closest thing to English would be nod, a nod, but I found that word a little poor. And I think that if I translate it as nod and cuddles, it would not have the same effect.
Yeah.
So I found the sound hug and ka. I found that poetry, that rhythm, the openness that it was in Portuguese. So although hugs is not literally the translation of acenos, but the sound and the idea of hugging being a first step of intimacy and then hugging another layer of intimacy, for me sounded perfect in English.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Mattilda. Thank you, Andrea. Thank you, Edgar, for this really wonderful conversation. Like I said at the start of this event, I've been looking forward to this since I read this book in February, and this really did not disappoint. I'm glad that we have this recording packaged and we can send it off into the world. If you have a bookstore near you, please go off and buy Hugs and Cuddles. Or if you don't have a bookstore near you, Third Place Books and Community Bookstore offer shipping across the country. We would love to provide you with this novel. Please go out into the world, be well. Do either of you have, or do any of you have any final words before we close out the evening?
Thank you so much for having me as part of this conversation. I'm in awe, Edgar. This book is really just, it's stunning.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all. This is an amazing conversation. I feel like it really deepened the experience of the book and all of its layers.
Thank you all for being here. I really appreciate the invitation, and stay safe, everybody.
Yeah, and thank you again, Community Bookstore in Brooklyn and Two Lines Press. You all rock in my world. You are all stalwart representatives of literature. So, all right.